In tonight's story, we are going to slowly travel back in time, into a world that existed long before modern medicine, long before microscopes, and long before anyone understood the invisible forces that shape the spread of disease. We'll follow the quiet rhythm of medieval life, watch how distant trade routes slowly connected continents, and see how an unseen bacterium began a journey that would change the course of history. This is the complete history of the Black Death, the pandemic that moved silently across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe during the 14th century, reshaping societies, economies, and the lives of millions of people. But we're going to explore it slowly, step by step, beginning with the calm and ordinary world that existed just before everything changed. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the quiet of the early 14th century, long before the catastrophe that would later haunt memory and legend, life across Europe moved with a rhythm that had changed little for generations. Villages rested beside slow rivers, small towns gathered around stone churches, and fields stretched outward in patchworks of grain, pasture, and woodland. People lived close to the land, and most lives were measured by the turning of seasons rather than the movement of clocks. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer meant tending crops and gathering hay. Autumn brought harvest and preparation for winter. Winter itself was a quieter season, when cold winds passed over frozen fields and people stayed close to hearth fires while mending tools, telling stories, and waiting for the land to awaken again. In towns, markets were lively centers of exchange. Farmers arrived with baskets of vegetables, sacks of grain, cheeses wrapped in cloth, and sometimes small animals bound gently with rope. Craftsmen displayed their work: wooden bowls, iron tools, woven fabrics, leather boots. The smells of bread ovens and cooking meat drifted through narrow streets lined with timber-framed houses. Travel was slow and uncertain. Most people rarely moved more than a few dozen miles from the place they were born. Roads were often little more than dirt paths, winding through forests and across open plains. Merchants traveled in small groups for safety, carrying goods from distant regions, spices from the east, silk from faraway cities, salt from coastal flats, and precious metals from mountain mines. At the edges of Europe, large trading networks connected continents. Caravans crossed deserts and grasslands, linking cities across Central Asia and the Middle East. Ships sailed along the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, transporting cargo between bustling ports. These routes had existed for centuries, forming an immense web of commerce and culture that connected distant societies. Few people in European villages understood the full scale of this network. To them, the wider world existed mostly through rumors and stories carried by travelers. Someone might mention a city where markets never slept, or lands where unfamiliar languages were spoken, or kingdoms ruled by emperors whose courts shimmered with gold and silk. Beyond Europe, the vast territories of Asia were undergoing their own transformations. The Mongol Empire, which had risen rapidly during the 13th century, stretched across enormous distances from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe. Though divided into several khanates, the empire maintained many shared systems that allowed trade and communication to move more freely than before. Caravans could travel under the protection of Mongol authority, moving along what historians later called the Silk Road. This network of routes passed through deserts, mountains, and grasslands, linking cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar. Traders carried silk, spices, precious stones, metal goods, ceramics, and countless other items between cultures separated by thousands of miles. Along with goods, travelers also carried ideas, languages, religions, and stories. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian missionaries, merchants, diplomats, and explorers all moved along these same roads. In the caravanserais, roadside inns scattered along the trade routes, people from distant lands sometimes shared meals beside the same fire. Camels rested in courtyards while travelers exchanged news about distant kingdoms, weather conditions across deserts, and rumors of political changes far away. These networks made the world more connected than many people realized. A merchant leaving a port on the Mediterranean might eventually trade with someone whose goods had come from China. A piece of silk woven in an eastern city could pass through many hands before reaching a noble household in France or Italy. This movement of goods and people created opportunities for wealth and cultural exchange, but it also meant that unseen forces could travel the same routes. In the early decades of the 14th century, subtle signs of disruption began appearing across parts of Asia. Historical records from China mention outbreaks of mysterious illnesses that spread quickly through certain regions. Villages reported sudden fevers, swelling in the body, and deaths that sometimes came within only a few days. At the time, such events were often interpreted through the lens of traditional beliefs, perhaps as punishments from heaven, imbalances in natural forces, or consequences of unfavorable winds and climate. In truth, no one yet understood the microscopic world of bacteria and pathogens. Disease was often explained through spiritual or environmental causes. Physicians relied on ancient medical texts that described the balance of bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, as the key to health. Treatments might include herbal mixtures, bloodletting, prayer, or changes in diet. Meanwhile, in the grasslands of Central Asia, natural environments supported enormous populations of small animals, including rodents that lived in burrows across wide plains. Among these creatures were marmots and other species that unknowingly carried a bacterium later identified as Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this bacterium had existed within natural animal reservoirs. Fleas feeding on infected animals could carry the bacterium in their digestive systems. When conditions allowed, these fleas sometimes moved to new hosts, including other animals and eventually humans. In most years, such transmissions remained limited within wildlife populations. However, environmental changes could disturb these natural cycles. Fluctuations in climate, shifts in animal populations, or movements of human trade could all alter the balance between species. When infected fleas encountered new hosts in densely populated areas, the bacterium could spread rapidly. By the 1330s and early 1340s, outbreaks of severe disease were reported in several regions of Asia. Chronicles from the Yuan dynasty in China mention devastating epidemics that affected large numbers of people. Entire communities experienced sudden losses. In some places, farmland was left untended as families struggled to survive waves of illness. Trade routes continued operating despite these disruptions. Merchants, caravan workers, sailors, and travelers kept moving goods across continents. Few realized that something far more dangerous than silk or spices might also be traveling with them. Fleas living among rodents in cargo holds or supply sacks could quietly accompany long journeys. Ships carried grain stores that attracted rats, which in turn carried fleas. Caravans transported textiles, furs, and food that might host hidden insects along the way. Around the middle of the 14th century, one particular region became associated with a dramatic moment in the spread of disease. Near the northern shores of the Black Sea stood the trading city of Kaffa, a port controlled by merchants from the Italian city-state of Genoa. Kaffa served as an important hub connecting European traders with markets deep in Asia. Ships from Mediterranean ports regularly arrived to load goods brought by caravans from inland territories. In 1346, the city was reportedly besieged by forces from the Mongol Golden Horde. During the siege, accounts describe a deadly illness spreading through the attacking army. According to later chronicles, the disease caused swelling in the groin and armpits, high fever, and rapid death. Some historical reports claim that infected bodies were hurled over the city walls in an attempt to weaken the defenders. Whether this event occurred exactly as described remains debated by historians. But the broader truth is clear. The disease was already present in the region and spreading among populations connected to long-distance trade. As the siege ended and ships departed the port, sailors unknowingly carried infected rats and fleas with them. These ships sailed westward across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. Ports in Sicily, Italy, and other coastal regions soon began receiving vessels whose crews were already sick or dying. When these ships docked, the illness moved quietly ashore. At first, the symptoms were confusing and terrifying. People developed sudden fevers accompanied by painful swellings known today as buboes, often appearing in the groin, neck, or armpits. Dark blotches sometimes formed on the skin. Within days, many victims died. The speed and severity of the illness stunned communities that had never witnessed anything like it. Physicians attempted treatments based on existing knowledge. Some recommended bloodletting to restore balance to the body's humors. Others burned aromatic herbs in homes to cleanse the air. Religious leaders organized prayers and processions, asking for divine mercy. Yet the disease continued spreading from port towns into inland cities and villages, following trade roads, rivers, and pathways used by travelers for centuries. By 1347, the first waves of what would later be called the Black Death had arrived in Europe, carried invisibly along the same networks that once connected distant cultures through trade and exploration. Few could yet imagine how profoundly the coming years would transform the societies of the medieval world. In the late months of 1347, the illness that had traveled quietly across continents began to settle into the ports and cities of southern Europe. Merchant ships arrived at harbors with crews weakened by fever, some barely able to stand as they staggered onto docks. Others never reached shore at all. Sailors were sometimes found lifeless aboard their vessels, their cargo still neatly stacked, as if nothing unusual had happened. At first, port officials and townspeople struggled to understand what they were seeing. Sickness was not uncommon in medieval societies. Outbreaks of disease occasionally appeared in crowded towns, or after harsh winters when food shortages weakened populations. Yet something about this illness felt different. The speed with which it spread and the severity of its symptoms seemed far beyond the familiar patterns of seasonal sickness. In the port city of Messina on the island of Sicily, chroniclers later described the arrival of ships carrying men already dying from the disease. According to these accounts, the sailors suffered from high fevers and strange swellings that appeared suddenly beneath the skin. Many died within only a few days of falling ill. The people of the city quickly realized that those who came into close contact with the sick often became ill themselves. Fear began to move through the streets. Families closed their doors, and some residents fled into the countryside, hoping distance might protect them. But the illness had already found ways to move beyond the harbor. Rats that lived aboard ships slipped onto the docks and into the narrow streets of the city. Fleas living on those rats carried the bacterium responsible for the disease. When their rodent hosts died or scattered, the fleas sought new sources of blood, sometimes biting humans. This silent exchange occurred unnoticed by those living in the city. Soon after the first ships arrived, people throughout Messina began falling ill. The pattern repeated in other ports. Genoese trading vessels reached cities along the Mediterranean coast, including Genoa itself, as well as ports in southern France. Venice, one of the most important maritime centers of the era, also received ships from infected regions. In each place, the story unfolded with similar confusion and growing dread. At first, a few isolated cases appeared. A merchant might fall ill after unloading cargo. A dock worker might develop a fever days after helping sailors bring goods ashore. Families cared for sick relatives within their homes, not realizing they might also be exposing themselves to infection. Within weeks, the number of cases increased. People began to notice the characteristic swellings beneath the skin. These painful lumps, sometimes the size of eggs or apples, were later known as buboes. They appeared most often in areas where lymph nodes were concentrated: the groin, the armpits, and the neck. Victims also experienced intense fatigue, chills, and delirium. Some developed dark patches on their skin caused by internal bleeding beneath the surface. These marks contributed to the name that would later become associated with the disease. Physicians struggled to explain what was happening. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe was based largely on ancient Greek and Roman texts, especially the works of Galen and Hippocrates. According to these traditions, illness resulted from imbalances among the body's four humors. Treatments therefore aimed to restore balance through methods such as bloodletting, purging, or adjusting diet and environment. Some doctors believed the disease might be caused by corrupted air, sometimes called miasma. They advised burning fragrant woods or herbs to cleanse the atmosphere. Others recommended avoiding certain foods believed to generate excess heat or moisture in the body. Wealthier households sometimes hired physicians who wore protective garments and carried bundles of aromatic plants to mask unpleasant smells. Despite these efforts, few treatments proved effective. The disease progressed rapidly once symptoms appeared. In many cases, people who felt healthy one day became gravely ill the next. Entire households could be affected within a short time. As deaths increased, towns faced challenges that went beyond medicine. Burial practices, which normally involved careful religious ceremonies, became difficult to maintain. Graveyards filled quickly. In some cities, mass graves were dug to accommodate the growing number of bodies. Clergy members worked tirelessly to perform last rites for the dying, though many priests themselves eventually fell ill. The psychological impact of the epidemic was profound. Communities that had once felt stable and familiar now seemed unpredictable and dangerous. People worried about ordinary interactions, touching a neighbor, sharing food, caring for relatives. Some individuals responded by withdrawing into isolation, while others sought comfort in religious gatherings or processions. Across the Mediterranean and into mainland Europe, the disease followed the pathways of commerce and travel. From Italy, it moved north into France and west into the Iberian Peninsula. Traders traveling inland carried the illness along major roads connecting market towns. Rivers served as additional routes of transmission, as boats transported goods and passengers between cities. By early 1348, the epidemic had reached cities such as Marseille, Florence, and Barcelona. Each city experienced the arrival of the disease as a sudden and unsettling shift in daily life. Markets that once bustled with activity became quieter as fear spread among merchants and customers. Workshops closed when craftsmen fell ill or fled the city. Agricultural work in nearby fields sometimes went unfinished because laborers were too sick or frightened to continue. Chroniclers who lived through these events left written descriptions that still provide glimpses of the human experience during the epidemic. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio later described how people reacted in different ways. Some attempted strict moderation, isolating themselves in small groups and avoiding excess food or drink. Others took the opposite approach, believing that life might be short and choosing to spend their days in feasting and music. Many families simply tried to endure, caring for loved ones while hoping the sickness would pass them by. Yet the disease showed little regard for social boundaries. Rich and poor alike were vulnerable. Nobles living in large homes sometimes fared slightly better because they could retreat from crowded districts. But even these precautions offered no guarantee of safety. In villages outside major cities, the disease sometimes arrived later, carried by travelers or wandering animals. Rural communities often had fewer people and less constant movement, which occasionally slowed the spread. However, once the illness appeared, limited medical knowledge and fewer resources made it difficult to respond effectively. As months passed, news of the epidemic traveled faster than the disease itself. Messengers, merchants, and refugees carried stories from one region to another. Reports described cities where large portions of the population had died within a single season. These accounts often seemed exaggerated to those who had not yet witnessed the illness firsthand. Yet as the disease continued advancing across Europe, the reports proved tragically accurate. In early 1348, the plague moved into northern Italy and southern France. From there, it continued along trade routes into the Alps and the Rhine Valley. Cities such as Avignon, which at the time served as the residence of the papacy, experienced devastating outbreaks. The Pope's court attempted various measures to protect themselves, including isolating certain residences and maintaining constant fires believed to purify the air. Meanwhile, ships sailing through the Mediterranean carried the disease to new destinations. Ports in North Africa reported outbreaks soon after contact with infected vessels. The illness thus began affecting communities on multiple continents simultaneously. As summer approached in 1348, the plague continued spreading steadily northward. Travelers moving along roads into Central Europe unknowingly carried infected fleas in clothing, blankets, or packs of goods. Rats living in warehouses and barns helped sustain the disease in urban environments. Once established in a city, the epidemic could linger for months. In many places, the pattern repeated with grim consistency. The disease appeared first in crowded districts near markets or docks. Within weeks, it spread into surrounding neighborhoods. Hospitals and charitable houses filled quickly with the sick. Local authorities sometimes attempted to regulate burials or restrict movement, though such measures were limited by the lack of understanding about how the disease actually spread. Despite the fear surrounding the epidemic, daily life did not completely stop. Bakers continued making bread because people needed food. Farmers still tended fields when they were able, hoping to harvest crops before winter. Merchants attempted to maintain some level of trade, though often with reduced activity. Communities tried to adapt to circumstances that changed with unsettling speed. As the year progressed, the plague approached the northern regions of Europe. By the end of 1348, it had reached parts of England. Ships traveling through the English Channel likely brought the infection into southern ports, such as Bristol and other coastal towns. From there, familiar patterns began to unfold once again, as fever and swelling appeared among residents who had never encountered such an illness before. In each place, the arrival of the disease seemed sudden. Yet in reality, it had been traveling quietly across continents for years, moving along the same routes that had once carried prosperity and cultural exchange between distant regions of the medieval world. By the time the disease reached England in 1348, much of Europe had already begun to feel the full weight of the catastrophe. Communities that had heard distant rumors now found themselves facing the same terrifying reality. Ships arriving at English ports carried more than cargo. They brought with them the invisible agents of a disease that few people could comprehend. Coastal towns were often the first to feel its impact. In places such as Bristol, one of England's busiest trading ports, merchants and dockworkers were among the earliest victims. As in cities across the continent, the first cases appeared suddenly. A sailor developed a fever. A merchant fell ill after unloading goods from a vessel. Within days, neighbors and family members began showing similar symptoms. From these early points of infection, the illness spread inland. Roads that connected towns and villages served as pathways for travelers, traders, and messengers. Each movement of people also carried the possibility of spreading disease. Before long, the plague reached larger cities, including London. Medieval London was a crowded and lively place, with narrow streets lined by wooden buildings that leaned close together. Waste disposal was primitive by modern standards, and animals roamed freely through many neighborhoods. Such conditions created an environment where rats and fleas could thrive, allowing the disease to spread with alarming efficiency. When the plague entered London, its effects were devastating. Chroniclers described how the number of deaths rose rapidly, overwhelming the city's ability to respond. Churches struggled to keep up with the demand for burial services. Cemeteries quickly filled, forcing authorities to establish large burial pits outside the city walls. Workers labored day and night to inter the dead, often with little ceremony. Daily life changed dramatically as the epidemic intensified. Markets grew quieter as merchants closed their stalls or fled to rural estates. Schools and workshops ceased operating when teachers and craftsmen became ill. Many households locked their doors in an attempt to protect themselves from the outside world. The fear of infection altered even the most ordinary human interactions. Friends hesitated to visit one another. Families sometimes separated when illness appeared in a household, hoping that distance might prevent further spread. In some cases, entire families died within a matter of weeks. Yet the plague did not strike every place with equal timing or severity. Some villages experienced outbreaks that lasted only a few weeks before the disease faded. Others endured months of repeated illness as new waves of infection appeared. Seasonal factors may have played a role. Warmer months often saw increased activity among fleas and rodents, while colder weather sometimes slowed transmission. Across England and the rest of Europe, clergy members were among those most heavily affected. Priests and monks often remained close to the sick, offering prayers, comfort, and last rites. Their willingness to care for the dying placed them in frequent contact with infected individuals. As a result, many clergy members succumbed to the disease themselves. In some regions, large numbers of parish priests died within a short period, leaving communities without spiritual leaders. Monasteries and convents also suffered heavy losses. These religious communities lived closely together, sharing meals, sleeping quarters, and daily routines. Once the disease entered such a setting, it could spread quickly among residents. Historical records from certain monasteries show that entire groups of monks died within a single season. Meanwhile, rulers and local authorities struggled to respond to a crisis that exceeded their experience. Medieval governments lacked the scientific understanding needed to address the disease effectively. Nevertheless, some leaders attempted practical measures. In certain towns, officials tried to regulate the movement of travelers or restrict trade from infected areas. Others organized the cleaning of streets and the removal of waste in hopes of improving public health. Some cities experimented with early forms of quarantine, isolating arriving ships or travelers for a period before allowing them to enter the community. Though these measures were inconsistent and often too late to prevent outbreaks, they represented early attempts to control the spread of disease through public policy. The psychological toll of the epidemic was as profound as the physical losses. Chroniclers from the period described how fear and uncertainty reshaped social behavior. Some individuals became deeply religious, interpreting the plague as divine punishment for human sin. Public processions of penitents appeared in certain regions, where participants prayed, fasted, and sometimes practiced acts of self-punishment in hopes of appeasing divine anger. At the same time, other people responded with resignation or despair. When survival seemed uncertain, some chose to abandon traditional social rules. Stories circulated of gatherings filled with music, drinking, and feasting, where participants attempted to forget the suffering surrounding them. These reactions reflected the emotional strain placed on communities facing a crisis unlike anything they had previously experienced. In addition to fear and grief, the plague also produced confusion and suspicion, because the true cause of the disease was unknown. People searched for explanations within the framework of their existing beliefs. Some blamed unfavorable alignments of the planets or changes in climate. Others suspected that poisoned air or contaminated water might be responsible. Tragically, certain groups became targets of persecution. In several regions, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease deliberately. These accusations led to violence and forced migrations, adding another layer of suffering to an already devastating time. While such events did not occur everywhere, they illustrate how fear and misunderstanding could amplify social tensions during periods of crisis. As the months passed, the scale of the catastrophe became increasingly clear. Entire neighborhoods stood partially empty. Fields in rural areas sometimes went unharvested because farmers had died or fled. Livestock wandered unattended in certain regions. The population losses varied from place to place. But historians estimate that in many parts of Europe, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population died during the first wave of the plague. These figures represent millions of people across the continent. Yet even amid such devastation, human societies continued adapting. Survivors gradually resumed certain activities once the most intense outbreaks subsided. Markets reopened in reduced form. Farmers planted new crops in fields that had briefly fallen silent. Communities began the slow process of rebuilding daily life. However, the world that emerged after the first wave of the Black Death was different from the one that had existed before. Labor shortages became increasingly apparent as the number of available workers declined. Landowners who had once relied on large numbers of peasants to cultivate their estates now faced difficulties maintaining agricultural production. In response, some attempted to impose stricter obligations on surviving workers, while others began offering better wages or improved conditions to attract labor. These shifts would eventually contribute to long-term changes in European society. Though such transformations unfolded gradually over decades, in the immediate aftermath of the first wave, communities were primarily focused on survival and recovery. Families mourned the loss of loved ones. Religious institutions replaced clergy who had died. Town councils addressed practical concerns such as property inheritance, abandoned homes, and the distribution of food supplies. The disease itself did not vanish entirely. In many regions, the plague lingered at lower levels after the initial surge. Sporadic outbreaks appeared in certain towns even after the main wave had passed. People remained uncertain whether the disease might return again in greater force. By the early 1350s, the first great wave of the Black Death had swept across most of Europe. From the Mediterranean to Scandinavia, from the Atlantic coast to the plains of Eastern Europe, few regions had escaped its reach. The continent had experienced one of the most dramatic population declines in recorded history. Yet the story of the Black Death did not end with this first devastating passage. In the years that followed, the plague would return periodically, shaping societies, economies, and cultural attitudes for generations to come. In the years immediately following the first devastating wave of the Black Death, Europe entered a period of uneasy recovery. The disease that had swept across the continent between 1347 and the early 1350s had left behind cities with reduced populations, villages partially abandoned, and vast stretches of farmland that had temporarily fallen silent. For those who survived, daily life gradually resumed, but it did so within a world that felt altered in both visible and subtle ways. One of the most immediate changes appeared in the countryside. Before the plague, agricultural labor had been abundant. Most peasants worked under systems that tied them to the land owned by nobles or monasteries. These workers cultivated crops, tended livestock, repaired buildings, and performed countless tasks necessary to maintain medieval estates. With so many people lost to the epidemic, however, landowners suddenly faced a shortage of workers. Fields that had once required dozens of laborers might now have only a handful of surviving families to tend them. Harvests became more difficult to organize, and some landowners struggled to maintain the same level of agricultural production as before. In response, they sought new ways to attract workers or compel existing tenants to remain. In some regions, authorities attempted to restore the previous balance by regulating wages and limiting the mobility of laborers. For example, in England, the government issued the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, followed later by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. These laws attempted to prevent workers from demanding higher wages and prohibited them from leaving their employers in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Yet, such regulations proved difficult to enforce. Survivors of the plague understood that their labor had become more valuable. Many peasants began negotiating for better wages, lighter obligations, or improved living conditions. Some moved from one estate to another, seeking opportunities that had rarely been available before the epidemic. Over time, these economic pressures gradually weakened aspects of the traditional feudal system. Although the transformation did not happen overnight, the labor shortages created by the Black Death contributed to long-term social changes that reshaped medieval European society. In towns and cities, the effects were equally complex. Urban populations had suffered enormous losses during the epidemic, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned workshops. At first, these spaces stood silent reminders of the catastrophe. However, as survivors adapted, many cities began attracting new residents from rural areas. People who had previously lived as peasants sometimes moved to towns where opportunities for trade or skilled labor appeared more promising. Artisans and craftsmen found that demand for their work remained strong, even as the number of available workers declined. As a result, wages for certain skilled professions increased. Guilds, associations of craftsmen that regulated trades such as weaving, metalworking, and carpentry, played an important role in organizing urban labor. These groups maintained standards for training and production while also providing support to members during difficult times. After the plague, some guilds expanded their membership as new workers entered city economies. At the same time, not every consequence of the Black Death was immediately beneficial to survivors. The emotional and psychological effects of the epidemic lingered for years. Entire generations had witnessed widespread death within their families and communities. The memory of sudden illness and mass burials remained vivid in collective consciousness. Religious institutions faced particular challenges during this period. Many clergy members had died while caring for the sick, leaving churches and monasteries in need of replacements. In some cases, new priests were appointed quickly in order to fill vacant positions. However, critics sometimes argued that these new clergy lacked the training or dedication of those who had served before the plague. This perception contributed to broader debates about the role and authority of religious institutions in society. While faith remained central to daily life for most people, the experience of the plague raised questions that would echo through later centuries. Some individuals wondered why such suffering had occurred despite prayers and religious devotion. Others sought deeper spiritual meaning in the catastrophe, interpreting it as a reminder of human mortality and the need for moral reflection. Artistic and literary expressions from the later 14th century often reflected these themes. Paintings, sculptures, and written works increasingly depicted the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. One artistic motif that became especially prominent during this era was the dance of death, or dance macabre. In murals and illustrations, figures representing death were shown leading people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, merchants, and clergy, in a symbolic procession. The message was simple yet powerful. Death eventually comes to everyone, regardless of wealth or status. Such imagery reflected a cultural environment deeply shaped by the collective memory of the plague. Yet it also served as a reminder that life continued despite tragedy. Communities rebuilt their churches, repaired city walls, and restored marketplaces that had once fallen silent. Meanwhile, the disease itself did not disappear completely. Although the first wave of the Black Death ended in many regions by the early 1350s, the bacterium responsible for the plague remained present in animal populations across parts of Eurasia. Fleas and rodents continued to carry the infection in certain environments. As a result, smaller outbreaks appeared periodically in different regions. These later epidemics were usually less catastrophic than the initial wave, partly because populations were smaller and partly because communities had begun developing rudimentary responses to disease outbreaks. Cities sometimes attempted early forms of quarantine. Ships arriving from areas known to have plague cases might be required to remain offshore for a certain period before unloading cargo or passengers. Travelers suspected of illness could be isolated outside city walls. One of the earliest systematic quarantine practices emerged in the Adriatic port city of Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik. In 1377, authorities introduced regulations requiring travelers from infected areas to spend 30 days in isolation before entering the city. This period later expanded to 40 days, giving rise to the term quarantine, derived from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40. These early public health measures were based on observation rather than scientific understanding. Officials noticed that isolating potentially infected individuals sometimes reduced the spread of disease. Though imperfect, such strategies represented important steps toward organized responses to epidemics. Trade continued throughout this period, though often with caution. Merchants remained essential to the economic life of medieval societies. Markets required goods from distant regions, and artisans relied on materials transported across long distances. However, the memory of the Black Death influenced how people perceived travel and commerce. In some ports, incoming ships were inspected more carefully. In others, authorities attempted to monitor travelers more closely than before. The long-term demographic consequences of the plague were profound. With fewer people living across Europe, land became more abundant relative to population. This shift affected patterns of settlement and agricultural production. Some previously cultivated areas were abandoned and gradually returned to woodland. In other regions, survivors consolidated farmland into larger holdings that could be managed by fewer workers. These adjustments slowly reshaped the rural landscape. The changes also influenced diets and living conditions. In certain areas, reduced population pressure allowed survivors to access more resources per person. Meat and dairy products became slightly more common in the diets of some rural communities, though these improvements varied widely depending on local circumstances. Despite these adaptations, the fear of renewed plague outbreaks never fully disappeared. People who had lived through the first wave understood how quickly the disease could transform ordinary life. Stories about the earlier years continued to circulate among younger generations who had not personally witnessed the epidemic. In monasteries and city archives, scribes recorded accounts of the catastrophe, preserving descriptions of the events for future readers. These chronicles documented not only the spread of disease, but also the responses of communities struggling to cope with unprecedented loss. Across Europe, the decades following the Black Death became a time of gradual rebuilding mixed with lingering uncertainty. The continent had lost millions of people, yet human societies demonstrated remarkable resilience. Markets slowly regained their vitality. New families moved into houses that had once stood empty. Fields again filled with crops swaying in the wind. And although the memory of the plague remained deeply etched into collective experience, the survivors of the 14th century continued shaping the world that would follow, adapting their lives to a landscape forever changed by one of history's most powerful pandemics. As the later decades of the 14th century unfolded, Europe slowly settled into a new social and economic reality, shaped by the lingering shadow of the plague. Although the first catastrophic wave had passed, the memory of those years remained vivid. People who had lived through the epidemic often spoke of it quietly, sometimes referring to it simply as the Great Mortality. For younger generations born afterward, the stories carried an almost mythical weight, describing a time when entire streets had fallen silent and when the ordinary routines of life had been suddenly overturned. Across the continent, communities worked steadily to rebuild the structures that supported daily life. Churches repaired damaged buildings and replaced sacred objects that had been neglected during the crisis. Town councils reorganized administrative systems to account for the reduced population. Landowners reassessed how to manage estates that now had fewer workers available to cultivate fields or tend livestock. One of the most noticeable transformations appeared in patterns of labor and employment. Because the population had declined so sharply, surviving workers found themselves in a stronger position than their predecessors. Farmers could sometimes negotiate better conditions for working land, and craftsmen in towns occasionally received higher wages for their skills. In certain regions, peasants began moving more freely between estates, searching for opportunities that offered improved treatment or lighter obligations. These changes did not happen without resistance. Many nobles and landowners attempted to restore older forms of control over laborers, fearing that the traditional social order might weaken if workers gained too much independence. Laws designed to limit wages or restrict movement appeared in several kingdoms, yet enforcing them proved difficult. The demographic realities created by the plague meant that labor was scarce, and workers knew their value. Meanwhile, trade networks that had once connected distant regions gradually recovered from the disruptions caused by the epidemic. Merchants returned to familiar routes linking the Mediterranean, northern Europe, and parts of Asia. Ships once again carried cargo between ports such as Venice, Genoa, Barcelona, and Constantinople. Caravans resumed journeys across inland routes that had existed for centuries. Yet the memory of how the plague had traveled along these same networks encouraged some communities to adopt cautious practices. Certain cities implemented inspection procedures for arriving travelers or goods. Harbor authorities sometimes monitored ships more closely, especially if rumors suggested that disease had appeared in other ports. These precautions were often inconsistent and based on limited understanding, but they represented early attempts to manage the risks associated with long-distance travel. Cultural life also evolved in the aftermath of the epidemic. Writers, artists, and thinkers across Europe reflected on themes of mortality, uncertainty, and the fragile nature of human existence. Literature from the late 14th century often included stories about sudden reversals of fortune or the unpredictable course of life. One famous example emerged from Florence, where Giovanni Boccaccio composed a collection of stories known as the Decameron. In the work's opening scenes, a group of young people flee the plague-ridden city and retreat to a countryside villa where they pass time by telling stories to one another. Although the tales themselves range from humorous to dramatic, the setting reflects the historical experience of people seeking refuge from the epidemic. Artistic expressions during this period frequently incorporated symbolic imagery related to death and renewal. Painters created scenes reminding viewers that wealth, power, and status offered no protection from mortality. Sculptors carved memorials honoring those who had died, while churches commissioned works intended to inspire reflection and spiritual devotion. At the same time, everyday life gradually regained rhythms that resembled the pre-plague era. Farmers planted crops in spring and harvested them in autumn. Markets once again filled with vendors selling grain, vegetables, cloth, and livestock. Children played in streets and courtyards, often unaware that their parents and grandparents carried memories of unimaginable loss. Yet the plague itself never truly vanished. The bacterium responsible for the disease continued circulating within natural reservoirs among rodents in various regions of Eurasia. From time to time, conditions allowed the infection to spill over again into human populations. These later outbreaks occurred sporadically across Europe during the late 14th and 15th centuries. Though generally smaller than the original catastrophe, they could still cause significant disruption within affected communities. Cities such as Paris, London, and Milan experienced repeated waves of plague over the following decades. Sometimes several years passed without major incidents, only for the disease to reappear suddenly in a crowded neighborhood or port district. Each new outbreak revived memories of the earlier disaster. Communities responded with increasing determination to contain the illness. Isolation of infected households became more common in certain regions. Some towns established designated areas outside their walls where the sick could be treated or kept separate from the general population. The concept of quarantine gradually developed further as officials observed that restricting movement sometimes slowed the spread of disease. In maritime cities, ships arriving from areas suspected of plague might be required to wait offshore or remain anchored for a specified period before passengers and cargo could disembark. Although these measures were far from perfect, they demonstrated a growing recognition that controlling movement could influence the course of epidemics. Over time, specialized institutions emerged to support these efforts. In parts of Italy, authorities established quarantine stations known as lazarettos, where travelers and goods could be isolated temporarily. These facilities represented some of the earliest organized public health structures in European history. Meanwhile, the demographic changes brought about by the Black Death continued influencing social dynamics for generations. With fewer people competing for land and resources, certain survivors experienced modest improvements in living standards. Houses that had once been crowded might now shelter fewer occupants. Agricultural fields sometimes produced enough food to sustain smaller populations more comfortably. In some regions, land that had previously been cultivated intensively returned to woodland or pasture. These environmental shifts altered local landscapes in subtle ways, encouraging the growth of forests and the expansion of grazing areas for animals. Livestock farming became more prominent in certain parts of Europe as landowners adjusted their strategies to match the available workforce. Despite these adjustments, the psychological imprint of the plague remained powerful. Sermons delivered in churches frequently reminded congregations of the unpredictability of life. Religious devotion often intensified in communities that had endured repeated outbreaks. Pilgrimages, charitable acts, and religious festivals became important expressions of collective identity and hope. For historians looking back across centuries, the Black Death stands as one of the most significant turning points in medieval history. It reshaped population patterns, influenced economic structures, and transformed cultural attitudes toward life and death. Yet for the individuals who lived through those years, the experience was far more personal than any broad historical interpretation. It was remembered through the empty chair at a family table, the silent workshop of a lost craftsman, the field once tended by neighbors who never returned. Even as Europe gradually rebuilt itself during the later 14th century, these memories lingered quietly within households and communities, forming part of the shared story of a continent that had endured an extraordinary trial and emerged into a world forever changed by the passage of a single devastating disease. As the 15th century approached, Europe had spent several decades living with the consequences of the Great Mortality. The immediate shock of the first wave had faded into memory, yet its effects remained woven into everyday life. Population numbers were still far lower than they had been before the middle of the 14th century, and the societies that survived were gradually adapting to this new reality. Villages that had once been crowded with families sometimes contained only a fraction of their former inhabitants. Some settlements disappeared entirely, leaving behind empty stone foundations slowly overtaken by grass and shrubs. Travelers occasionally passed these abandoned places and wondered about the people who had once lived there. In certain regions, these deserted villages became known as lost villages, silent reminders of a population that had once been larger and more densely distributed across the landscape. At the same time, many surviving communities became more stable and prosperous than before. With fewer people competing for land and resources, some peasants gained access to larger plots of farmland. Families could cultivate more acres than their ancestors had managed, producing greater harvests for their households. In some places, diets improved slightly as meat, dairy products, and fresh produce became more accessible to ordinary people. Urban life also continued evolving. Cities that had suffered catastrophic losses slowly rebuilt their populations through migration from surrounding countryside. Young men and women seeking opportunity often moved to towns where skilled trades and commerce offered possibilities unavailable in rural villages. Over time, these movements helped repopulate urban centers that had once seemed permanently diminished. Guilds remained important institutions within city economies. These organizations regulated training, production standards, and commercial practices for many trades. Apprenticeships allowed young workers to learn skills under the guidance of experienced masters. After several years of training, apprentices could become journeymen and eventually masters themselves, opening their own workshops and contributing to the economic life of the city. Meanwhile, trade networks continued linking distant regions of Europe and beyond. Merchants transported grain from fertile plains, wool from pastoral regions, timber from northern forests, and luxury goods from the Mediterranean and the East. Markets once again buzzed with the sounds of bargaining voices, clinking coins, and the movement of carts carrying goods through narrow streets. Although commerce revived, the memory of plague outbreaks never fully disappeared from the minds of those involved in long-distance trade. Port authorities sometimes kept records of diseases reported in other cities. If rumors suggested that an epidemic had appeared elsewhere, travelers arriving from those regions might be monitored carefully. These early public health precautions were still based on limited understanding, yet they represented a growing awareness that disease could travel along the same routes as commerce. Scientific knowledge about the true cause of plague would not emerge until many centuries later. In the 15th century, people still relied on traditional explanations rooted in astrology, environmental theory, or religious belief. Physicians often studied ancient medical texts that described illness as a disturbance in the balance of bodily humors. Treatments remained focused on restoring equilibrium through diet, herbal remedies, or procedures such as bloodletting. Although these methods did little to cure plague itself, physicians continued serving important roles as advisors and caregivers within their communities. Religious interpretations also remained powerful. Many people viewed epidemics as part of a divine plan, or as warnings encouraging moral reflection. Churches held special prayers asking for protection from disease, and processions sometimes moved through city streets as communities gathered to seek spiritual comfort during times of uncertainty. Cultural expressions continued reflecting the profound impact that the plague had made on European consciousness. Art and literature from the 15th century often returned to themes first intensified during the Black Death. Images of skeletons, hourglasses, and fading flowers symbolized the passage of time and the inevitability of death. Yet, alongside these reminders of mortality, appeared expressions of renewal and hope. Artists depicted scenes of harvest, celebration, and daily life continuing despite past suffering. These works suggested that even after tragedy, human communities could rebuild and find meaning in ordinary experiences. Meanwhile, the plague itself remained an intermittent presence. Outbreaks appeared periodically throughout the 15th century, though most were smaller than the original catastrophe. Cities such as Venice, Milan, Paris, and London recorded episodes where the disease resurfaced, sometimes lasting months before fading again. Each new outbreak reminded people that the threat had not vanished entirely. As a result, authorities in some regions refined their strategies for managing epidemics. Quarantine regulations became more formalized in certain port cities. Travelers arriving from infected areas might be required to remain isolated in designated buildings or islands before entering the city. Goods suspected of carrying contamination could be aired out or held for extended periods before being sold in markets. These measures gradually became more systematic, especially in parts of Italy where maritime trade remained intense. Venice in particular developed a reputation for strict quarantine practices, using islands in its lagoon to isolate ships and passengers suspected of carrying disease. Such policies represented early steps toward organized public health administration. Demographic recovery across Europe occurred slowly over many decades. Birth rates eventually began increasing as populations stabilized. Families who had survived the initial epidemic often had more opportunities to establish households and raise children because land and employment were more available than before. By the late 15th century, some regions had regained a significant portion of the population lost during the Black Death, though the process varied widely depending on local conditions. The social transformations triggered by the plague continued influencing historical developments long after the epidemic itself had faded from immediate memory. Labor shortages had weakened rigid feudal systems in certain areas, allowing peasants greater mobility and bargaining power. Urban economies had adapted to new patterns of trade and production. Cultural attitudes toward life, death, and uncertainty had shifted in ways that shaped literature, philosophy, and art for generations. For historians examining this era centuries later, the Black Death stands not only as a devastating pandemic, but also as a catalyst for change. It forced societies to confront the fragility of established structures and encouraged adaptations that might otherwise have taken far longer to occur. Yet from the perspective of individuals living through those years, such transformations unfolded gradually and often quietly. Most people focused simply on rebuilding their homes, tending their fields, raising children, and maintaining the ordinary routines that give structure to daily life. Over time, the memories of the first great wave of plague blended into the broader tapestry of medieval history. Stories passed down through families preserved fragments of those years when sickness had swept across continents. Church records, town archives, and personal writings continued documenting outbreaks that appeared from time to time in later centuries. Through these sources, the experience of the Black Death remained present in collective memory, reminding future generations of how deeply a single disease had once reshaped the world. As the 15th century continued, the memory of the Great Mortality slowly transformed from immediate trauma into historical experience. People who had personally witnessed the first wave of the Black Death were now elderly, and many younger individuals knew the events only through stories told by parents or grandparents. Yet even as time created distance from the catastrophe, its consequences remained deeply embedded in the structures of European society. Agricultural landscapes across the continent had changed in subtle ways. Before the plague, population pressure had forced farmers to cultivate nearly every available piece of land. Hillsides, marsh edges, and forest clearings were often converted into fields in order to support growing numbers of people. After the dramatic population decline, many of these marginal lands were gradually abandoned. Over time, grasses, shrubs, and young trees reclaimed areas that had once been plowed. This quiet environmental shift reshaped the countryside, creating more pasture and woodland in certain regions. Livestock farming expanded in places where grain cultivation had previously dominated. Sheep grazing became particularly important in parts of England and the Low Countries, where wool production supported thriving textile industries. Wool from these regions was exported across Europe, supplying workshops where weavers produced cloth for both everyday use and international trade. In cities, artisans continued refining their crafts while merchants strengthened connections between distant markets. The rhythm of commercial life once again filled urban streets. Carts rolled through gates carrying goods from surrounding countryside. Barges moved along rivers transporting barrels, sacks, and crates between towns. Market squares became lively meeting points where buyers and sellers negotiated prices beneath the watchful eyes of town officials. Despite this revival, the awareness of disease remained present. Communities had learned from painful experience that epidemics could arrive without warning. Because the cause of plague remained unknown, people relied on observation and tradition to guide their responses. When news of illness appeared in neighboring towns, authorities sometimes attempted to restrict gatherings or limit travel. Although such measures were unevenly applied, they demonstrated a gradual development of collective strategies aimed at reducing risk. The port cities of the Mediterranean became especially active in refining quarantine practices. Venetian officials, for example, established permanent quarantine facilities on islands within the lagoons surrounding the city. Travelers and goods arriving from regions suspected of infection could be held there for observation before entering the city itself. These stations were equipped with warehouses where cargo could be aired out, and living quarters where travelers waited during the required period of isolation. Similar practices spread to other trading centers as officials observed their potential effectiveness. Even without understanding bacteria or vectors such as fleas, people recognized that limiting contact between infected and healthy populations could influence the spread of disease. Cultural life during this era continued reflecting themes shaped by the memory of the Black Death. Writers explored questions about fate, chance, and the fragile nature of human plans. Plays and poems sometimes described characters confronting sudden misfortune, echoing the historical experience of societies that had witnessed widespread death within a single generation. Visual art also preserved reminders of mortality. Church walls in certain regions displayed frescoes depicting the dance of death, where skeleton figures led people of all social ranks in a symbolic procession. These images reminded viewers that kings, bishops, merchants, and peasants all shared the same ultimate destiny. Yet such artworks were not purely expressions of despair. Many also emphasized moral reflection and the value of living a meaningful life despite uncertainty. The Renaissance, a cultural movement that began gaining momentum during the 15th century, emerged partly within the world shaped by the aftermath of the plague. Scholars and artists rediscovered classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, studying philosophy, mathematics, literature, and art. Human curiosity about the natural world grew stronger, leading to renewed interest in science, exploration, and learning. Some historians suggest that the demographic and economic changes following the Black Death helped create conditions that allowed new ideas to spread more rapidly. With fewer rigid constraints on labor and social mobility, talented individuals sometimes found greater opportunities to pursue education or artistic work. Wealth accumulated by merchants and bankers funded the construction of libraries, universities, and artistic projects that defined the intellectual climate of the Renaissance. Meanwhile, the plague continued appearing intermittently across Europe. Outbreaks in the late 15th century reminded people that the disease had not disappeared entirely. Cities such as Milan occasionally implemented strict measures to contain infection, including isolating neighborhoods where cases had appeared. Officials sometimes posted guards to prevent residents from leaving affected districts, hoping to prevent the disease from spreading further into the city. Such responses were not always successful, yet they revealed an evolving understanding that coordinated public action could influence the course of epidemics. Although plague outbreaks still caused fear, they rarely matched the scale of the first great wave that had swept across Europe more than a century earlier. Populations had become accustomed to living with the possibility of disease, adapting their institutions and behaviors accordingly. By the end of the 15th century, Europe had largely recovered in demographic terms, though population levels in many regions remained somewhat below those that had existed before 1347. Fields once abandoned were gradually brought back into cultivation as new generations grew and communities expanded again. The story of the Black Death, however, remained permanently written into the historical memory of the continent. Chroniclers preserved detailed accounts describing how ships had carried the disease from distant lands, how cities had filled with fear, and how millions of lives had been lost within only a few years. These records became valuable sources for later historians attempting to understand one of the most dramatic events in human history. Centuries after the original epidemic, scholars would identify the bacterium responsible for the plague and trace its transmission through fleas carried by rodents. Modern science eventually revealed the biological mechanisms that medieval people could only guess at through observation and experience. Yet even without that knowledge, the societies of the 14th and 15th centuries responded with resilience and adaptation. They developed early forms of quarantine, reorganized economic systems, and expressed their experiences through art and literature that still resonates today. The Black Death was not merely a moment of destruction, but a profound turning point that reshaped societies across continents. Its story is one of loss and recovery, fear and adaptation, reminding later generations how deeply human history can be influenced by forces that remain invisible to the eye, yet powerful enough to transform the course of civilizations. As Europe moved into the 16th century, the great catastrophe of the Black Death belonged increasingly to the distant past. Yet the disease itself had not vanished from the world. Plague remained present in many regions, occasionally emerging in sudden outbreaks that reminded communities of earlier centuries. By this time, however, societies had accumulated generations of experience dealing with epidemics. Cities had begun developing more organized systems for responding when illness appeared. In several Italian states, health boards were established to monitor reports of disease and coordinate responses. These early public health institutions were responsible for inspecting ships, enforcing quarantine regulations, and supervising the sanitation of streets and marketplaces. Although the scientific understanding of disease remained limited, these measures represented a growing recognition that coordinated action could protect communities from widespread infection. One of the most influential examples of organized epidemic response occurred in Venice. As one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean, the city faced constant risk from ships arriving from distant regions. Venetian authorities developed strict quarantine protocols, requiring vessels suspected of carrying disease to remain isolated on designated islands before entering the lagoon. Officials also maintained records of illness reported in other ports, creating an early form of international disease surveillance based on merchant reports and diplomatic correspondence. Meanwhile, the natural reservoirs of plague remained active across parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Rodent populations in grasslands and rural environments continued hosting the bacterium responsible for the disease. When environmental conditions allowed, the infection could spill into human populations once again. Trade routes linking continents ensured that outbreaks in one region occasionally spread to others. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe experienced several notable plague epidemics. One of the most severe occurred in the Italian city of Milan in 1630. During this outbreak, authorities attempted to enforce strict isolation measures, including closing city gates and restricting movement between districts. Despite these efforts, the disease spread widely, and tens of thousands of residents died within a relatively short period. Similar tragedies unfolded in other cities during this era. In 1625, London suffered a major outbreak that killed many thousands of people. Another devastating epidemic struck the city again in 1665, an event that would later become known as the Great Plague of London. During that year, the disease spread rapidly through crowded neighborhoods, forcing many residents to flee into the countryside, while others remained behind under quarantine. Houses with infected occupants were sometimes marked to warn neighbors of the danger within. Guards were occasionally stationed outside such homes to ensure that residents did not leave during the quarantine period. Markets closed, theaters suspended performances, and normal social life largely disappeared as the city attempted to contain the epidemic. The following year, a catastrophic fire swept through London, destroying large portions of the city. Although the fire itself caused immense damage, it also eliminated many of the crowded structures and unsanitary conditions that had previously supported large rat populations. Some historians have suggested that these changes may have contributed to reducing the likelihood of future plague outbreaks in the city. By the late 17th century, plague epidemics in Western Europe became less frequent. The reasons for this decline remain a subject of historical and scientific debate. Some researchers suggest that improvements in urban sanitation and building construction reduced opportunities for rats and fleas to thrive in dense human settlements. Others propose that changes in rodent populations or environmental conditions altered the dynamics of disease transmission. Whatever the precise cause, the pattern of devastating plague epidemics gradually diminished across much of Western Europe after the 17th century. Nevertheless, the disease persisted in other parts of the world. Outbreaks continued appearing in regions of the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa. Trade and travel occasionally carried cases between continents, reminding global societies that plague remained part of the natural landscape of infectious disease. The 18th and 19th centuries eventually brought new scientific approaches to understanding illness. Advances in microscopy allowed researchers to observe microorganisms that had previously been invisible. During the late 19th century, scientists finally identified the bacterium responsible for plague. In 1894, the Swiss-French physician Alexandre Yersin isolated the organism while studying an outbreak in Hong Kong. The bacterium was later named Yersinia pestis in recognition of his discovery. This breakthrough marked a turning point in humanity's understanding of the disease that had once devastated medieval societies. Researchers soon confirmed that fleas living on rodents acted as the primary vectors transmitting the bacterium between animals and humans. With this knowledge, public health authorities could develop targeted strategies to control outbreaks by addressing rat populations and preventing flea transmission. Modern medicine eventually introduced antibiotics capable of treating plague infections when administered early. Although the disease remains present in certain natural reservoirs around the world, effective treatments and improved sanitation have greatly reduced its impact compared with the catastrophic epidemics of earlier centuries. Today, the story of the Black Death continues to fascinate historians, scientists, and the general public alike. Archaeological excavations of mass burial sites have provided physical evidence of the epidemic's scale. Genetic studies of ancient remains have confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in victims who died during the 14th century. Written chronicles preserved in medieval archives allow researchers to reconstruct how the disease spread through cities, villages, and trade networks. These sources reveal not only the biological history of the plague, but also the human experiences that accompanied it. They describe fear, grief, resilience, and adaptation as communities confronted an invisible enemy they could neither see nor understand. The Black Death remains one of the most transformative events in recorded history. It reshaped economies, altered social structures, influenced cultural expression, and accelerated changes that helped move Europe from the medieval world toward the early modern era. Yet beyond its historical significance, the story also serves as a reminder of the complex relationship between human societies and the natural world. Diseases that originate in wildlife populations can sometimes cross into human communities with dramatic consequences. The medieval people who lived through the Black Death lacked the scientific knowledge to explain what was happening around them, yet they responded with the tools available to them: faith, observation, community organization, and gradual experimentation with public health measures. Their experiences contributed to the long historical process that eventually produced modern epidemiology and global health systems. When historians study the centuries following the Black Death, they often see a pattern of resilience emerging from catastrophe. Communities rebuilt their towns, restored their economies, and created new cultural achievements in art, literature, and science. The legacy of the plague, therefore, extends far beyond the tragedy of the epidemic itself. It forms part of a broader narrative about how human societies endure crises, adapt to changing circumstances, and continue shaping the course of history even after moments of profound disruption. As centuries passed and scientific understanding advanced, historians and researchers began examining the Black Death not only as a tragic historical event, but also as a complex intersection of biology, environment, trade, and human society. The pandemic of the 14th century had emerged from natural systems that had existed long before medieval civilizations developed their cities and trade networks. Rodent populations across the grasslands of Central Asia had carried the bacterium responsible for plague for generations, often without dramatic consequences for human populations living far away. It was the growing interconnectedness of the medieval world that allowed the disease to travel so widely. By the 13th and 14th centuries, long-distance trade routes connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe more closely than ever before. Caravans crossed deserts and mountain passes carrying silk, spices, precious stones, and countless other goods. Ships sailed across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, transporting cargo between ports that served as gateways between continents. These routes enabled remarkable cultural exchange, allowing ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions to move between societies separated by thousands of miles. Yet the same routes also provided pathways for disease. Fleas living among rodent populations could travel unnoticed within cargo shipments or aboard ships filled with grain and textiles. Rats thriving in the crowded storage areas of vessels often accompanied merchants from one port to another. When infected fleas transferred from rodents to humans, outbreaks could begin in places far removed from the original source of infection. From a modern perspective, the Black Death illustrates how human expansion and trade networks can influence the movement of infectious diseases. The medieval people who experienced the pandemic did not understand the microbial mechanisms involved, yet their observations laid the groundwork for later scientific inquiry. Over time, physicians and scholars noticed patterns linking outbreaks to certain environmental conditions, trade routes, and population densities. These observations gradually encouraged more systematic approaches to public health. By the early modern period, many cities maintained health boards responsible for monitoring disease reports and implementing quarantine policies when necessary. Ports inspected ships arriving from distant regions, sometimes isolating vessels for weeks before allowing passengers and cargo to enter the city. These measures were imperfect, but represented an early recognition that collective action could reduce the spread of epidemic illness. Archaeological research conducted in modern times has revealed further insights into the Black Death. Mass burial sites discovered beneath medieval towns contain the remains of individuals who died during the epidemic. Through careful analysis, scientists have been able to extract fragments of ancient DNA from these skeletons. Genetic testing confirms the presence of Yersinia pestis in many of these remains, providing direct evidence linking the bacterium to the pandemic described in historical chronicles. These scientific discoveries have allowed researchers to reconstruct how the plague evolved and spread over time. Different strains of the bacterium appear to have circulated during various outbreaks, indicating that the disease adapted and moved through populations in complex ways. Some strains may have originated in Central Asia before traveling westward through trade networks into Europe and the Middle East. Other outbreaks in later centuries may have arisen independently from natural reservoirs, where the bacterium persisted among wildlife. Environmental history has also contributed to the understanding of how the Black Death emerged. Climate fluctuations during the 14th century may have influenced rodent populations in certain regions of Asia, increasing the likelihood that infected fleas would seek new hosts. Periods of drought or changes in vegetation could have altered animal migration patterns, bringing disease-carrying species into closer contact with human communities. While historians continue debating the precise environmental triggers, it is clear that the pandemic was not simply a random event. It resulted from the interaction of ecological systems, economic networks, and human settlement patterns. Cultural historians, meanwhile, examine how societies process the emotional and psychological impact of the catastrophe. Artworks created in the decades following the Black Death frequently emphasized themes of mortality and the fleeting nature of earthly life. Religious writings encouraged reflection on humility and compassion, reminding believers that wealth and power offered no guarantee of safety. Literary works described characters confronting uncertainty and seeking meaning in a world where sudden tragedy had become a lived experience. These cultural expressions reveal how deeply the pandemic shaped the collective imagination of medieval Europe. Yet alongside sorrow and reflection, there were also signs of resilience. Communities rebuilt their homes and institutions, sometimes with renewed determination to improve conditions that had previously allowed disease to flourish. Urban planning gradually incorporated wider streets and improved waste disposal systems. Governments recognized the importance of maintaining organized responses to epidemics. Over many generations, these incremental changes helped create the foundations of modern public health infrastructure. Today, the Black Death remains one of the most studied pandemics in history because of its enormous demographic and social consequences. Estimates suggest that between 25 and 50 million people may have died in Europe alone during the initial wave, representing a substantial portion of the continent's population. Similar devastation occurred in parts of Asia and the Middle East, though historical records from those regions are sometimes less detailed. The scale of mortality reshaped societies in ways that influenced the course of world history. Labor shortages altered economic relationships between landowners and workers. Cultural attitudes toward authority, faith, and human vulnerability evolved in response to collective trauma. Over time, these shifts contributed to broader transformations that historians associate with the transition from the medieval world to the early modern era. Even in the modern age, the story of the Black Death continues offering lessons about the importance of understanding infectious disease. Advances in medicine, sanitation, and scientific research have greatly reduced the threat posed by plague compared with earlier centuries. However, the bacterium responsible for the disease still exists in certain wildlife populations around the world. Sporadic human cases occasionally appear, though modern antibiotics allow effective treatment when the illness is diagnosed early. The pandemic of the 14th century therefore remains both a historical milestone and a reminder of humanity's ongoing relationship with the microbial world. It illustrates how interconnected societies can experience rapid change when biological forces intersect with human systems of trade, settlement, and governance. By studying the Black Death, historians and scientists gain insight not only into the past, but also into the ways societies prepare for and respond to epidemic challenges. The quiet villages and bustling cities of medieval Europe could not foresee the invisible journey that would reshape their world. Yet through endurance, adaptation, and gradual learning, those societies laid the foundations for the medical and public health knowledge that later generations continue building upon today. In the centuries that followed the last major plague epidemics in Europe, the Black Death gradually shifted from lived memory into the realm of historical study. By the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars increasingly approached the event with curiosity rather than fear. Libraries preserved medieval chronicles written by monks, city officials, and travelers who had recorded their observations during the pandemic. These documents described empty streets, overflowing cemeteries, and the confusion people felt as the illness spread from town to town. For later historians, these first-hand accounts became invaluable windows into the past. Through them, it was possible to reconstruct how the disease moved across continents and how communities attempted to respond even without scientific knowledge of bacteria or infection. As the discipline of history developed during the 19th century, researchers began comparing records from different regions. Patterns slowly emerged, showing how the plague had followed major trade routes linking Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Ports were often the first places to experience outbreaks, followed by inland cities connected through rivers and roads. This pattern confirmed that commerce and mobility had played important roles in the spread of the disease. Around the same time, advances in the natural sciences transformed the study of disease itself. The development of germ theory during the 19th century revealed that many illnesses were caused by microscopic organisms. Scientists such as Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch demonstrated that bacteria could be responsible for infections previously attributed to mysterious environmental influences or divine intervention. Within this new scientific framework, researchers began examining historical epidemics with fresh perspective. When Alexander Yersin identified the plague bacterium in 1894, historians suddenly had a biological explanation for the symptoms described in medieval records. Swellings known as buboes, high fevers, and rapid death all matched the characteristics of infection caused by Yersinia pestis. This discovery allowed scholars to connect medieval descriptions of plague directly to a specific microorganism. From that moment forward, the Black Death became not only a historical subject, but also a case study in epidemiology. Scientists analyzed how the bacterium moved between animals and humans, how fleas served as vectors, and how environmental conditions influenced outbreaks. Researchers studying rodent populations in Central Asia discovered that plague could survive for long periods within wildlife reservoirs without causing major human epidemics. Occasionally, however, ecological changes allowed the bacterium to jump into human communities, where crowded living conditions enabled rapid transmission. In the 20th century, archaeological discoveries added another layer of understanding. Excavations beneath European cities uncovered burial pits dating back to the 14th century. Some contained hundreds of skeletons arranged in hurried layers, suggesting that the victims had been buried quickly during times of crisis. Modern techniques allowed scientists to analyze DNA extracted from these remains. The genetic material confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in victims of the Black Death, providing direct biological evidence that supported historical records. Such findings strengthened the connection between written chronicles and scientific investigation. Meanwhile, historians continued exploring how the pandemic had transformed medieval society. Population decline forced economic systems to adapt, weakening rigid feudal relationships and allowing greater mobility for workers. Labor shortages gave peasants leverage to negotiate better conditions, while urban craftsmen gained increased demand for their skills. These shifts did not immediately dismantle the medieval social order, but they created pressures that gradually encouraged change over generations. Cultural historians also examined how the plague influenced art, literature, and religious thought. The themes of mortality and uncertainty that appeared in late medieval art were not simply abstract ideas. They reflected the lived experience of communities that had witnessed death on an enormous scale. Churches displayed paintings reminding viewers of life's fragility, while poets and writers explored questions about fate, suffering, and human resilience. Even centuries later, echoes of those themes can still be found in European cultural traditions. By the 20th century, the Black Death had become a central topic in historical scholarship. Universities offered courses examining the pandemic from multiple perspectives, including economics, medicine, environmental history, and cultural studies. Historians debated the exact scale of mortality, the speed at which the disease spread, and the ways different societies responded to the crisis. Some scholars focused on demographic reconstruction, using tax records and parish documents to estimate how populations changed before and after the epidemic. Others explored local case studies that revealed how individual towns experienced the pandemic in unique ways. Advances in technology continued expanding the field. Computer models allowed researchers to simulate how plague might have moved along trade routes or through densely populated cities. Climate scientists studied tree rings and ice cores to understand environmental conditions during the 14th century. These interdisciplinary approaches demonstrated that the Black Death was not simply a medical event, but a complex historical phenomenon shaped by many interacting forces. In modern times, the story of the Black Death often appears in books, documentaries, and educational programs that introduce audiences to medieval history. The dramatic scale of the pandemic captures the imagination because it illustrates how profoundly disease can influence human civilization. At the same time, modern audiences view the event through the lens of scientific knowledge unavailable to medieval societies. Today, doctors understand how plague spreads and how it can be treated with antibiotics. Public health systems monitor outbreaks and coordinate responses across national borders. These developments represent centuries of learning that grew partly from experiences with earlier epidemics. The Black Death therefore occupies a unique place in historical memory. It was both a moment of devastating loss and a turning point that contributed to long-term changes in society, medicine, and governance. For the people who lived through the 14th century, it was an overwhelming and mysterious tragedy. For later generations, it became an opportunity to study how human communities respond to crisis and how knowledge evolves over time. Even now, historians continue uncovering new details about the pandemic by examining overlooked archives, conducting archaeological research, and applying modern scientific techniques. Each discovery adds another small piece to the larger puzzle of how one disease reshaped the medieval world. Through these efforts, the Black Death remains not only a story of the past, but also a reminder of the resilience and adaptability that have allowed human societies to endure even the most extraordinary challenges. As modern historians continue studying the Black Death, they often emphasize how interconnected the medieval world had already become long before the age of modern globalization. Although travel in the 14th century was slow by contemporary standards, trade networks still stretched across enormous distances. Goods moved gradually from one region to another, through chains of merchants, caravans, and ships. Spices harvested in Southeast Asia could travel through Indian Ocean ports, pass across Middle Eastern markets, and eventually reach European cities months or even years later. Silk woven in Chinese workshops might be transported along caravan routes across Central Asia before arriving in Mediterranean trading centers. These networks allowed cultures to exchange ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions, enriching societies across continents. Yet the same connections also allowed disease to move silently between populations that had never previously encountered certain pathogens. The Black Death demonstrated how biological events could follow the pathways created by economic expansion. From the perspective of environmental history, the pandemic illustrates the relationship between human activity and natural ecosystems. Rodent populations carrying plague bacteria had long existed in parts of Asia, living within ecological systems that rarely produced widespread human epidemics. It was the expansion of trade and the movement of goods that eventually allowed infected fleas to travel far beyond their original habitats. When these fleas encountered dense human settlements, the conditions for epidemic transmission emerged. This combination of environmental factors and human networks created one of the most devastating pandemics recorded in history. Another aspect that historians explore involves how information about the plague spread between communities. In the 14th century, news traveled primarily through word of mouth, handwritten letters, and traveling merchants. When outbreaks occurred in one city, reports might take weeks to reach neighboring regions. People often heard fragmented stories describing unusual illness or sudden death in distant towns. At first, such reports may have seemed exaggerated or difficult to believe. Only when the disease arrived locally did communities fully grasp the scale of what was happening across the continent. The slow movement of information contributed to the confusion that surrounded the early stages of the epidemic. Without reliable knowledge about the cause of the disease, communities searched for explanations that fit their existing worldview. Astrological theories suggested that unusual alignments of planets might have poisoned the air. Some physicians believed earthquakes or volcanic activity had released harmful vapors into the atmosphere. Religious interpretations emphasized moral reflection, suggesting that the epidemic represented divine punishment for human wrongdoing. Although these explanations did not identify the true biological cause, they reveal how people attempted to understand events that seemed overwhelming and mysterious. Social responses to the plague varied widely depending on local circumstances. In some places, communities supported one another through acts of charity and care for the sick. Religious institutions often organized assistance for the poor and dying. Monasteries and hospitals attempted to provide shelter and comfort, even though many caregivers risked infection themselves. In other situations, fear led to withdrawal and isolation. Families sometimes avoided contact with neighbors or even relatives in order to protect themselves. Markets closed, travel declined, and entire districts could become eerily quiet as residents stayed indoors hoping the disease would pass them by. These contrasting reactions reflect the emotional complexity of living through a pandemic without clear understanding of its causes. Historians studying letters and personal accounts from the period often notice how individuals struggled to reconcile grief with the need to continue daily life. Farmers still had to plant crops. Merchants still needed to manage trade, and city officials still had to maintain order within communities experiencing rapid loss. The endurance of these routines demonstrates the resilience that allowed societies to function even under extreme circumstances. Over time, the memory of the Black Death became embedded within European cultural identity. Stories about the epidemic were passed down through generations, sometimes evolving into moral lessons about humility and compassion. Churches commemorated victims through memorial services, while local traditions occasionally preserved legends describing miraculous survivals or acts of bravery during the crisis. Historians examining these traditions recognize that collective memory can shape how societies interpret the past. The way people remember the Black Death is influenced not only by the historical facts, but also by the cultural meanings attached to those events. During the 19th and 20th centuries, as historians gained access to more archival material, they began reconstructing detailed timelines of how the pandemic spread. By comparing tax records, burial registers, and municipal documents, researchers estimated the population losses experienced by specific towns. Some regions appear to have lost nearly half their inhabitants during the first wave, while others experienced slightly lower mortality depending on local conditions. These demographic studies help historians understand how the epidemic altered patterns of settlement and economic activity. Modern scientific research has further refined the understanding of plague transmission. Studies of flea behavior show how the bacterium can block the digestive tract of infected insects, causing them to feed repeatedly and transmit bacteria during each bite. This mechanism helps explain how plague can spread rapidly within environments where infected rodents and fleas are abundant. Combined with crowded living conditions typical of many medieval cities, these biological factors created the conditions for explosive outbreaks once the disease arrived. Despite the catastrophic losses associated with the Black Death, the centuries that followed demonstrated the capacity of human societies to adapt and rebuild. Economic structures evolved, cultural creativity flourished during the Renaissance, and scientific inquiry eventually transformed the understanding of disease. What began as an incomprehensible disaster in the 14th century ultimately contributed to the long development of public health systems, epidemiology, and medical research. Today, the Black Death remains a powerful example used by historians and scientists to illustrate how pandemics influence civilization. It reveals the importance of understanding disease ecology, maintaining effective public health measures, and recognizing how interconnected human societies have always been. The medieval world that experienced the pandemic may seem distant from the modern age, yet the fundamental lesson remains familiar. Human history is shaped not only by kings' wars and inventions, but also by microscopic organisms moving quietly through the networks that connect people across the planet. By the time historians in the modern era assembled the full narrative of the Black Death, it had become clear that the pandemic represented more than a single moment of crisis. It was a long historical process that unfolded across decades, connecting distant regions and influencing generations of people who never witnessed the first outbreak themselves. The disease moved through trade networks, lingered within animal populations, returned in later waves, and gradually shaped the institutions that societies created to protect themselves from future epidemics. When examining the Black Death from a long historical perspective, One of the most striking elements is the speed with which it spread across vast distances, despite the slow transportation methods of the medieval world. Caravans crossing deserts and ships sailing across seas might take months to complete their journeys, yet the disease followed those routes steadily from one region to another. A port city that appeared safe one season could be overwhelmed by illness the next, because communities had little warning before the arrival of the disease. The first cases often appeared suddenly, creating a sense of shock that chroniclers repeatedly described in their writings. The symptoms themselves were frightening and unfamiliar. Victims often experienced intense fever, weakness, and painful swellings in areas where lymph nodes were concentrated. These swellings sometimes darkened as infection progressed. In many cases, death followed quickly, sometimes within only a few days. Such rapid progression made it difficult for families and physicians to provide effective care. The unpredictability of survival added to the anxiety that surrounded the disease. Some individuals recovered after days of illness, while others who seemed healthy one morning might be dead within the week. Without knowledge of bacteria or vectors, medieval physicians struggled to explain these differences. Their theories about corrupted air, planetary alignment, or imbalance of bodily humors reflected attempts to interpret the illness using the intellectual frameworks available at the time. Even though these theories were incorrect, they demonstrate the determination of scholars and physicians to understand the forces shaping their world. The social consequences of the pandemic were visible everywhere. In villages, the loss of farmers meant that fields sometimes went unplanted, or harvests were left incomplete. In towns, workshops closed when craftsmen died or fled. Monasteries lost entire communities of monks who had once maintained libraries, gardens, and schools. Government officials struggled to maintain order while managing burial arrangements and caring for orphans left behind by the epidemic. Yet amid these disruptions, the fundamental structures of society did not collapse entirely. Markets reopened once the most severe outbreaks subsided. Families formed new households. Religious institutions appointed new clergy to replace those who had died. Over time, communities rebuilt their routines, though the demographic landscape had changed dramatically. One of the most significant long-term effects of the Black Death involved the redistribution of economic opportunities. With fewer workers available, labor became more valuable. Peasants and artisans who survived sometimes found themselves able to negotiate wages or conditions that would have been impossible before the plague. This shift gradually weakened aspects of the traditional feudal system that had tied peasants closely to land controlled by nobles. Although the transformation occurred unevenly across regions, it contributed to the slow evolution of social structures in late medieval Europe. Cultural expressions during the decades after the plague reveal how deeply the experience influenced collective imagination. Writers described characters confronting uncertainty and searching for meaning in a world where sudden tragedy had become part of lived experience. Artists painted scenes reminding viewers of the equality of all people in the face of death. These works were not simply reflections of despair. Many also conveyed messages about resilience, faith, and the importance of community during times of hardship. Over centuries, the story of the Black Death continued evolving as historians uncovered new evidence and scientific discoveries clarified the biological mechanisms behind the disease. Archaeological excavations revealed burial grounds where victims had been interred quickly during the height of the epidemic. Genetic analysis of skeletal remains confirmed the presence of the plague bacterium in many of these individuals. Such research helped bridge the gap between historical narrative and biological science. In the modern era, the study of the Black Death has become an interdisciplinary field drawing from history, archaeology, genetics, climatology, and epidemiology. Scholars collaborate across disciplines to reconstruct how environmental changes, trade networks, and human behavior interacted to create the conditions for the pandemic. Climate data extracted from tree rings and ice cores provides clues about weather patterns during the 14th century. These environmental records may help explain fluctuations in rodent populations that carried the bacterium responsible for plague. Genetic studies trace how different strains of Yersinia pestis evolved and spread across continents. Through these combined approaches, researchers continue refining the understanding of how the pandemic unfolded. Despite the advances of modern scholarship, the human dimension of the Black Death remains central to its historical significance. Behind every statistic about mortality were individual lives interrupted by disease. Families lost parents, children, friends, and neighbors. Communities mourned leaders, teachers, craftsmen, and laborers whose absence reshaped the social fabric of daily life. The emotional weight of these losses echoes through the writings left behind by those who lived during the epidemic. Their words describe grief, fear, confusion, and also determination to continue living despite overwhelming circumstances. When modern readers encounter these accounts, they often recognize emotions that remain familiar across centuries. Pandemics in later periods remind societies that infectious disease continues to be part of the human experience. Although modern medicine offers tools that medieval communities could never have imagined, the fundamental challenge of responding collectively to disease remains relevant. The story of the Black Death therefore serves as both historical record and enduring lesson. It reveals how human societies respond when confronted by forces beyond immediate understanding. It demonstrates the importance of observation, adaptation, and cooperation in the face of crisis. And it reminds us that even the most devastating events can eventually give way to renewal as communities rebuild their lives and carry forward the memory of what they endured. As historians look across the full span of the Black Death's history, one of the most remarkable aspects is how an event that lasted only a few years at its most intense could influence centuries of development afterward. The first wave of the plague between 1347 and the early 1350s changed the demographic structure of Europe so dramatically that its consequences continued unfolding long after the immediate epidemic ended. Entire generations grew up in a world shaped by the absence of those who had died, and this absence quietly altered the balance of land, labor, wealth, and opportunity. Before the pandemic, Europe had experienced steady population growth for several centuries. Towns expanded, forests were cleared for farmland, and rural communities worked hard to cultivate enough crops to feed the increasing number of people. By the early 14th century, some historians believe parts of Europe had reached the limits of what medieval agricultural technology could easily support. Harvest failures and food shortages had already begun appearing during the decades before the plague arrived. When the Black Death struck, it suddenly reversed centuries of demographic growth. With so many people lost, the pressure on land and resources eased almost overnight. Farms that once required large families to manage could now be maintained by fewer workers. In some regions, survivors inherited property that had previously been divided among many heirs. This shift created opportunities that would have seemed unimaginable to earlier generations. Peasants who once struggled to secure enough land to feed their families sometimes found themselves with access to larger fields or improved living conditions. At the same time, these changes also created tensions within existing social systems. Landowners whose estates depended on large labor forces suddenly faced shortages of workers. Some attempted to reinforce traditional obligations, requiring peasants to continue working under older feudal arrangements. Others recognized that the balance of power had shifted and began offering better wages or more flexible agreements in order to attract laborers. These economic negotiations gradually reshaped relationships between social classes across many parts of Europe. In cities, the consequences were equally noticeable. Urban populations had declined sharply during the epidemic, leaving workshops without skilled artisans and markets without enough merchants to maintain previous levels of activity. In response, cities often welcomed migrants from rural areas who hoped to improve their prospects by learning a trade. This movement contributed to the gradual repopulation of towns that had seemed nearly empty during the height of the plague. Over time, new generations filled the streets again with the sounds of craftsmen hammering metal, weavers operating looms, and traders calling out prices in crowded marketplaces. Cultural life evolved alongside these demographic and economic changes. Artists and writers of the late medieval and early Renaissance periods often reflected on themes connected to the fragility of life. The sudden loss experienced during the Black Death encouraged deeper reflection on mortality and the passage of time. Paintings, sculptures, and poems sometimes depicted the contrast between worldly success and the inevitability of death. Yet these artistic expressions also celebrated the persistence of life, emphasizing beauty, creativity, and the value of human experience even in an uncertain world. Religious institutions also adapted to the new environment created by the plague. The loss of many clergy members during the epidemic required churches to train and appoint new priests in large numbers. In some cases, the rapid replacement of clergy led to criticism about declining standards of education or discipline within the church. These concerns became part of broader debates about religious authority that would eventually contribute to movements of reform in later centuries. Meanwhile, the scientific understanding of disease remained limited for many generations after the Black Death. Although communities developed practical strategies such as quarantine and isolation, the true biological cause of the plague remained unknown until the late 19th century. During the medieval and early modern periods, physicians continued relying on traditional theories about humors, environmental influences, and the balance of bodily elements. Despite these limitations, careful observation gradually improved responses to epidemics. Cities recorded patterns of illness, monitored travelers, and attempted to isolate infected individuals when possible. Each outbreak provided new experience that communities used to refine their strategies. Over centuries, these efforts contributed to the emergence of organized public health systems. The story of the Black Death, therefore, forms part of a longer history of how societies learn from crisis. The pandemic forced people to confront questions about medicine, governance, and collective responsibility. Even though medieval communities lacked the scientific tools available today, their responses laid the groundwork for later advances in epidemiology and disease prevention. In modern times, historians, scientists, and archaeologists continue studying the Black Death to understand not only what happened in the 14th century, but also how pandemics influence human history more broadly. Genetic research reveals how the plague bacterium evolved over time, and how different strains moved through populations. Archaeological evidence from burial sites provides insight into mortality rates and burial practices during the epidemic. Climate studies help researchers examine whether environmental conditions may have influenced rodent populations that carried the disease. Each new discovery adds depth to the understanding of how one pandemic reshaped the medieval world. Yet beyond statistics and scientific explanations, the Black Death remains a story about human experience. It tells of families who faced sudden loss, communities that struggled to care for the sick, and survivors who rebuilt their societies after unimaginable disruption. It reveals how fear and uncertainty can coexist with compassion, resilience, and creativity. When modern readers encounter the chronicles written by those who lived through the epidemic, they often sense the same mixture of confusion and determination that accompanies crises in any era. The quiet villages, busy ports, and crowded marketplaces of the 14th century were inhabited by people whose daily concerns were not so different from those of later generations. They worried about food, work, family, and faith. When the plague arrived, it disrupted those ordinary lives in ways no one could have predicted. Yet the societies that endured the catastrophe eventually continued forward, carrying with them the lessons and memories of what had happened. The Black Death remains one of the clearest reminders in history that human civilization, no matter how stable it may appear, always exists within a broader natural world, capable of sudden and profound change. As historians reflect on the centuries following the Black Death, they often emphasize that the pandemic did not simply destroy medieval society, but reshaped it in ways that gradually encouraged transformation. The world that emerged in the late 14th and 15th centuries was different from the one that had existed before the epidemic. Populations were smaller, economic relationships had shifted, and cultural attitudes toward life and death carried the imprint of collective experience. These changes did not occur all at once. They unfolded slowly as communities adapted to new circumstances and rebuilt their institutions. One of the most visible changes appeared in the relationship between land and labor. Before the plague, much of Europe had experienced steady population growth for generations. As more people required food and shelter, farmers cleared forests and expanded cultivation into increasingly marginal land. After the population decline caused by the Black Death, many of these lands were no longer necessary for immediate agricultural production. In some areas, fields were abandoned and gradually returned to grassland or woodland. This environmental recovery altered the appearance of the countryside, creating landscapes that would remain for centuries. At the same time, the reduced population meant that labor became a more valuable resource. Surviving workers were often able to negotiate better wages or more favorable working conditions. In England, France, and parts of Germany, peasants occasionally resisted attempts by landowners to restore older feudal obligations. While these conflicts did not immediately dismantle feudalism, they revealed that the balance of power between landowners and workers had begun to shift. Urban life also continued evolving under the influence of these demographic changes. Cities that had lost large portions of their population slowly recovered through migration from surrounding rural areas. Young people seeking opportunity moved to towns where apprenticeships and trade offered the possibility of economic advancement. Over time, these migrations helped replenish the population of cities that had once seemed nearly deserted during the worst years of the epidemic. Markets gradually regained their energy as merchants resumed long-distance trade. Ships again carried goods across the Mediterranean, while caravans continued transporting products between Asia and Europe. These commercial activities supported the growth of banking and finance, particularly in Italian city-states such as Florence, Venice, and Genoa. Wealth generated through trade allowed merchants and patrons to support artists, scholars, and architects whose work would later define the cultural flowering known as the Renaissance. Cultural life during the late medieval period remained deeply influenced by the memory of the plague. Artists and writers frequently explored themes connected to mortality, fate, and the passage of time. The suddenness with which the epidemic had taken lives encouraged reflection on how fragile human existence could be. Yet alongside these reminders of death appeared expressions of beauty, curiosity, and intellectual exploration. Renaissance scholars studied classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, rediscovering ideas about philosophy, science, and human potential that had been preserved in manuscripts for centuries. This renewed interest in learning gradually transformed education and scholarship across Europe. Universities expanded their curricula to include subjects such as mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Although medical knowledge remained limited by modern standards, the careful study of anatomy and natural science began laying foundations for future discoveries. Meanwhile, the periodic return of plague outbreaks continued reminding societies that the disease had not disappeared completely. During the 15th and 16th centuries, smaller epidemics appeared in various regions of Europe. These outbreaks were usually less catastrophic than the original pandemic, partly because populations were smaller and partly because communities had developed strategies for responding to disease. Quarantine measures became more organized in many port cities. Officials monitored travelers arriving from regions known to have plague cases and sometimes required them to remain isolated for weeks before entering the city. These early public health systems represented an important step toward coordinated responses to epidemic threats. Over generations, these measures became increasingly formalized, leading to the establishment of permanent health boards in some cities. By the 17th century, these institutions were responsible for inspecting ships, enforcing sanitation rules, and maintaining records of disease outbreaks. Although the scientific understanding of infection would not emerge until much later, these practices demonstrated that communities were learning from past experiences. Modern historians often view the Black Death as a turning point, because it accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken far longer to occur. Economic flexibility increased as labor shortages weakened rigid social hierarchies. Cultural creativity flourished as artists and thinkers explored new perspectives on human life. Public institutions developed gradually in response to the need for coordinated action during times of crisis. Each of these developments contributed to the transition from the medieval world to the early modern period. Yet despite these long-term transformations, the human stories behind the pandemic remain its most powerful legacy. Medieval chronicles describe parents caring for sick children, neighbors burying neighbors, and communities struggling to maintain hope during years when death seemed present everywhere. These accounts reveal how individuals responded to circumstances that were frightening and confusing, yet unavoidable. Even as entire regions faced extraordinary loss, people continued planting crops, baking bread, repairing buildings, and raising families. Daily life did not stop completely. It adjusted and endured. This resilience is one of the defining aspects of the Black Death's historical significance. The pandemic demonstrated how societies can survive even the most severe disruptions and eventually rebuild the structures that support human life. Centuries later, the lessons drawn from that experience continue informing how historians and scientists think about epidemics. The Black Death reminds us that disease can alter the course of history in profound ways. Yet it also shows how adaptation, cooperation, and gradual learning allow societies to recover and move forward. In the centuries after the Black Death, the memory of the pandemic remained deeply embedded in historical consciousness, even as everyday life moved forward and societies continued evolving. Chroniclers who lived through the catastrophe had described cities filled with fear, villages left nearly empty, and entire families disappearing within weeks. These accounts preserved a vivid record of how sudden and overwhelming the epidemic had seemed to those who experienced it firsthand. Later generations reading those chronicles often struggled to imagine the scale of disruption that had occurred in the 14th century. Yet the physical and social traces of the event remained visible for a long time. In many regions, abandoned villages never returned to life. Foundations of old houses remained scattered across fields that had gradually turned back into pasture or woodland. Archaeologists centuries later would discover pottery fragments, broken tools, and other remnants of settlements that vanished during or shortly after the plague years. These quiet landscapes serve as reminders that demographic collapse can reshape geography as well as society. The reduction in population also influenced patterns of land ownership. Properties once divided among many heirs sometimes passed into the hands of fewer families. In certain areas, large estates formed as survivors inherited land from relatives who had died without direct descendants. This consolidation changed agricultural practices and the structure of rural communities. Some landowners shifted their focus from labor-intensive grain farming to livestock grazing, which required fewer workers. Sheep and cattle became increasingly important in regions where pasture replaced former cropland. Urban development followed a different pattern. While some towns declined permanently, many cities eventually regained population through migration and natural growth. Streets that had once seemed deserted gradually filled again with shops, workshops, and markets. Skilled craftsmen resumed producing textiles, metal goods, pottery, and other items essential to everyday life. Merchant families rebuilt commercial networks that connected Europe with trading partners across the Mediterranean and beyond. Over time, these revived trade systems contributed to broader economic expansion during the late medieval and early modern periods. Cultural memory of the plague also found expression in storytelling traditions and local legends. In some communities, tales circulated about miraculous survivals or mysterious visitors who had warned of the coming epidemic. Other stories described acts of generosity by individuals who cared for the sick despite the danger. These narratives reflected attempts by later generations to interpret the experiences of their ancestors and to find meaning in events that had once seemed incomprehensible. Religious institutions played a central role in preserving these memories. Monasteries and churches often kept detailed records of deaths, burials, and charitable activities during the epidemic. Priests who had survived sometimes wrote reflections describing how the crisis affected their faith and their communities. These writings provide historians with valuable insight into the spiritual responses that accompanied the physical suffering of the pandemic. At the same time, the intellectual climate of Europe gradually changed as scholars pursued new approaches to understanding nature and the human body. Renaissance thinkers encouraged observation and experimentation, challenging traditional explanations that had dominated medieval scholarship. Although this transformation took place over many generations, it eventually led to the development of modern scientific methods. In the field of medicine, physicians began studying anatomy more carefully and documenting diseases with greater precision. Universities expanded medical training and encouraged the systematic recording of symptoms and treatments. While these early efforts did not immediately solve the mystery of plague, they represented important steps toward a more empirical understanding of illness. The connection between sanitation and health also received increasing attention in certain cities. Authorities responsible for maintaining public order recognized that crowded streets filled with waste could contribute to unpleasant odors and possibly disease. Regulations governing waste disposal, street cleaning, and market hygiene slowly improved conditions in some urban environments. Although medieval sanitation remained far from modern standards, these gradual reforms helped reduce some of the environmental factors that had previously allowed rodents and insects to thrive in dense settlements. During the 17th century, several major plague outbreaks still occurred in parts of Europe, reminding societies that the disease remained part of the natural world. Cities such as Marseille, Vienna, and London experienced periodic epidemics that revived the fears recorded in earlier chronicles. Yet communities now responded with more organized strategies than those available during the first wave of the Black Death. Quarantine systems had become more formalized, and officials often monitored travelers carefully when news of disease appeared in neighboring regions. Over time, these responses became part of routine administrative practice. Health boards established in various cities coordinated efforts to isolate infected individuals, supervise burial practices, and regulate commerce during outbreaks. Though imperfect, these institutions represented the beginnings of structured public health management. By the 18th century, large-scale plague epidemics had largely disappeared from Western Europe, though the disease continued appearing in other parts of the world. The reasons for this decline remain debated among historians and scientists. Some scholars point to improvements in urban infrastructure and sanitation that reduced opportunities for rats and fleas to thrive. Others emphasize ecological changes in rodent populations or shifts in climate that altered patterns of transmission. Whatever the precise explanation, the disappearance of major epidemics allowed European societies to focus more attention on economic development, scientific inquiry, and global exploration during the early modern era. Yet the legacy of the Black Death never completely faded. Historians continued studying the pandemic as one of the defining events of medieval history. Archaeologists uncovered burial sites and artifacts that revealed details about how communities coped with mass mortality. Scientists analyzing ancient DNA confirmed the presence of the plague bacterium in skeletons from 14th century graves. Each discovery deepened understanding of how the disease had spread and how societies had responded. Today, the Black Death remains one of the most important examples used to study the interaction between human civilization and infectious disease. It demonstrates how environmental factors, trade networks, social structures, and biological organisms can combine to produce events that reshape entire continents. At the same time, it reminds us that behind every historical transformation are the experiences of individuals whose lives were interrupted by forces they could not see or understand. Their resilience, recorded in chronicles and preserved in archaeological remains, continues telling the story of how humanity endured one of the most devastating pandemics ever known. As the study of the Black Death expanded in modern scholarship, historians began to understand the pandemic not only as a European tragedy, but as a truly global event that unfolded across multiple continents. Although the most detailed historical records come from Europe, evidence from the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of China suggests that the plague caused devastating population losses in many regions beyond the boundaries of medieval Christendom. Persian chronicles described cities where large portions of the population died within months. Arabic scholars wrote about the spread of the disease through trade centers of the Islamic world, including Damascus and Cairo. Chinese records from the 14th century mention widespread epidemics that coincided with political instability and social disruption during the final decades of the Yuan dynasty. These accounts reveal that the Black Death was part of a much larger wave of disease that moved through interconnected regions stretching across Eurasia. The Mongol Empire, which had created relatively secure trade routes across Central Asia during the 13th and early 14th centuries, inadvertently contributed to the spread of the disease. The empire's network of roads, relay stations, and protected caravan routes allowed merchants and travelers to move more freely between distant regions. While this system promoted commerce and cultural exchange, it also enabled pathogens to travel alongside goods and people. By the time the plague reached Mediterranean ports and entered Europe, it had already been circulating through many other parts of the Eurasian world for years. Understanding this broader geographic context helps historians explain how quickly the pandemic expanded across such enormous distances. The same routes that connected empires and economies became channels through which disease could move silently from one population to another. Once the plague reached Europe, its effects were amplified by the structure of medieval society. Cities were densely built, sanitation systems were limited, and knowledge about infectious disease was extremely restricted. These conditions created an environment where the bacterium responsible for plague could spread rapidly once it entered a community. Yet even in these circumstances, people continued searching for ways to protect themselves and their families. Medical practitioners attempted treatments based on herbal mixtures, dietary advice, and traditional theories about balancing the body's humors. Religious leaders encouraged prayer, charity, and moral reflection as communities struggled to interpret the meaning of the catastrophe. Although these responses could not stop the disease, they reveal how individuals tried to respond using the cultural and intellectual tools available to them. The psychological impact of the pandemic was enormous. Chroniclers repeatedly described how familiar social bonds seemed to weaken during the height of the epidemic. Fear of infection sometimes discouraged people from caring for neighbors or even relatives. At the same time, other accounts highlight acts of remarkable compassion, where individuals risked their own lives to assist the sick or provide burial for the dead. These contrasting stories demonstrate how crises can reveal both the vulnerability and the strength of human communities. As the first wave of the Black Death eventually subsided in the early 1350s, survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding societies that had lost a significant portion of their population. Fields needed to be cultivated again, houses repaired, and institutions restored. The process of recovery unfolded slowly over decades as new generations grew up in a world shaped by the aftermath of the epidemic. Economic systems adjusted to the reduced population, often giving workers greater leverage in negotiating wages and conditions. Cultural life reflected the experience through artistic themes emphasizing the passage of time and the inevitability of death. Religious institutions reorganized to replace clergy members who had died while caring for the sick. Each of these changes contributed to the transformation of late medieval society. Centuries later, historians began analyzing the Black Death as one of the major turning points in world history. Some scholars argue that the pandemic accelerated developments that eventually contributed to the end of the medieval period and the emergence of early modern Europe. Others emphasize that the transformation was gradual and varied widely across regions. Regardless of interpretation, there is broad agreement that the scale of the demographic shock created by the plague forced societies to adapt in ways that influenced long-term historical trajectories. Modern scientific research has continued expanding knowledge about the biological and environmental aspects of the disease. Genetic sequencing of ancient plague bacteria recovered from medieval skeletons allows scientists to compare strains from different outbreaks across centuries. These studies suggest that the bacterium responsible for the Black Death evolved and spread through complex networks of animal reservoirs and human trade routes. Environmental historians also investigate how climate variations may have influenced rodent populations and the movement of fleas that transmitted the disease. By combining historical documentation with modern scientific techniques, researchers are gradually building a more detailed picture of how the pandemic developed and spread. Today, the Black Death is often studied alongside other major epidemics as part of a broader history of global health. Its story highlights the importance of understanding how human mobility, ecological change, and social organization interact with infectious diseases. Even though modern medicine has dramatically improved humanity's ability to diagnose and treat illnesses, the fundamental challenge of responding to emerging pathogens remains a constant concern for societies around the world. The Black Death, therefore, serves as both a historical narrative and a reminder of the complex relationships that connect human populations with the biological world. The medieval people who experienced the pandemic could not have imagined the scientific explanations that later generations would uncover. Yet their experiences, preserved in chronicles, letters, and archaeological remains, continue informing modern understanding of how pandemics unfold and how communities respond to extraordinary challenges. Through their resilience and adaptation, they shaped a legacy that remains part of global historical memory today. And so the story of the Black Death slowly fades into the wider flow of history, becoming less a moment of sudden catastrophe and more a quiet reminder of how deeply human life is connected to the natural world around it. Long after the last great outbreaks passed through medieval towns and villages, the echoes of that time remained in small and subtle ways. Fields that had once been abandoned continued growing crops again under the care of new generations of farmers. Market squares that had once fallen silent gradually filled again with voices, carts, and the familiar sounds of trade. Churches repaired their walls, towns rebuilt their streets, and families formed new households in places where earlier generations had been lost. Over time, the fear that once surrounded the plague softened into memory, and that memory became part of the shared story that communities told about their past. Historians would later study records written in fading ink, reading the observations of monks, travelers, and city officials who had tried to understand what was happening around them. Archaeologists would uncover the quiet evidence left beneath layers of earth, piecing together the lives of people who lived through one of history's most difficult periods. Scientists would eventually discover the tiny bacterium responsible for the disease, revealing that the force which had once terrified entire continents was invisible to the naked eye. Yet for the people of the 14th century, none of those answers existed. They lived day by day, responding as best they could with the knowledge and beliefs they possessed. And still, despite the uncertainty, life continued. Children were born who would grow up hearing stories of the great mortality as something that had happened long ago. Craftsmen returned to their workshops, shaping wood and metal into tools and objects needed for ordinary life. Farmers watched the seasons change just as their ancestors had always done, planting in the spring and harvesting in the autumn beneath the same sky that stretched quietly over fields and villages. In this way, the world gradually moved forward, not suddenly but slowly, with the steady rhythm that defines most of human history. The plague that once seemed unstoppable eventually became one chapter among many in the long story of civilization. It left behind lessons about resilience, about the strength of communities, and about the unpredictable forces that can shape the course of human events. But above all, it reminds us that even after moments of great loss, life continues to grow again in quiet and ordinary ways. The roads that once carried merchants and travelers still wind across the landscape. The towns that once feared the arrival of disease still stand beside rivers and hills. And the memory of those distant years settles gently into the past, like evening light fading across the fields, leaving behind a world that continues turning season after season, just as it always has.